Start off the panel with the first question for you, which goes to all of the panelists actually. If we reflect on your own career, just so we can kind of step into this creative industry and space even more so, what was the moment or project that made you fall in love with the creative industry? And for bonus points, how do you see AI influencing similar moments for future creatives?
We're ending this.
No, we're starting. Surprise!
Well, I'm not sure I can pick out a particular the moment, but it's basically about going to, in my case, hearing and seeing music and performance, and it's that kind of feeling where the hands already somehow transmitted somewhere. And I think for me, relating it to AI, it's about AI as a creative tool and how AI can create some methods and transmitters and moments. Thank you. All
right. So the moment I fell in love with the creative industries, honest confessional moment, it would have been when I met my partner 6 years ago. So I am married to an early career artist, and I think being with someone who creatively expresses on a regular basis and also uses new technology caused me to revisit what I wasn't doing. And it reminded me of the things that I had done so long before that. So the dancing and the performing, it's really brought me home to myself. As a policy person, you end up using your brain quite an awful lot. Hopefully a bit of emotional intelligence too, but it's a very cerebral profession. And the thing that has really made fall in love with the cultural and creative industries over the last year since I joined the sector has been this integrated approach I feel more able to take in my body, in my emotion, in my mind, in my spirit. It feels much more holistic. I feel a lot more human. I feel a lot more whole. So when I think about future creatives working with AI, listen, I think my favorite thing to think about is that I just don't think we have any idea what they're going to do. I think they're going to disrupt it in an exponential way that we can't quite anticipate. And some of the coolest things I have been hearing about are creatives who are working out with artificial intelligence structures. So people looking to disrupt it by not participating. But that's the thing about creativity. You can't really guarantee what it's going to generate yet. It's the excitement that we have.
Cool. Now I'm going to show my age. May 1977, walking into an audience cinema and watching George Lucas's Star Wars for the first time. And the reason why that inspired me and kind of in some way has taken me on the journey that I've been on is because it wasn't just the cinematography and that experience of storytelling and wonderment, but that amazing John Williams score that came alongside that film that brought it all together and that left you wanting to see it again. And we wasn't in the age of streaming where you could go and rewatch. You had to pay again at the cinema and rewatch. But I did that several times. And I think what I've learned out of combining both interests in film and in music is that technology has assisted the development and enhancement of the creative industries hugely over the decades. In film, from green screen, blue screen, CGI, etc. In music, using all forms of technology within production and creativity. So it can be a really positive asset and something that we can get excited about. But equally, it has got danger written all over it if copyright and IP is not respected, looked after, and that's what we'll get into today. And so I think it's finding the balance. I'm not going to use the words of the Force, of course.
Right. Well, there's no particular moment I can really identify, but I can talk about a few sort of important turning point moments. I was very fortunate to grow up in a household with parents who really valued music in particular, but also the arts in general. And so they dragged me to things that I've been an unwilling child, to public libraries and churches and the like, where the local classical ensemble was playing, or to a museum to see Rothko paintings, and to be exposed to things and to stare at them or listen to them and ask, like, what is this? What's going on here? What's going on here? And meanwhile, because I was so inured with a particular view of what art was, this singular goal, I was going to be a rock star like the Beatles and so on. And they forced my hand to expand my mind, to expand my understanding of what the arts could be and what they could mean. Fast forward to many years later, as the prospect of being a famous rock and roll star had started to dwindle, and I realized that I was surrounded by lots of people who were making art in all sorts of ways, and sometimes for money and sometimes not, or sometimes the money was very small, sometimes the money was mediocre, often there was no money at all, but they were doing it out of passion and love. And I came to join them. I did work in Seattle for many years when I lived there, and did other things like that I found incredibly nourishing. The technology side of it came when I decided to transform what I had learned along the way as a musician and try to do what we would call serious music, writing music for stage and film and the like. And I found at that point I didn't really have a community of other people who were doing that to reach out to, having been sort of in rock and roll for so long. And I found that technology could be my stand-in community, not the same as a real community, but it could at least get me to the next level. And I was able to start writing music using digital tools and start making really interesting music and doing projects that I wouldn't have been able to easily do otherwise. I'm very grateful for that opportunity.
I think I've got a similar wannabe rock star story to you actually. Except for mine, I think started when I was maybe like 6 or 7 or something like that, going to Carnival. Not the London, Huddersfield Carnival, that's where I'm from up north. And feeling the bass from the sound systems, but like rattling your chest, like almost feeling like it's giving you a heart attack. Like intense bass, and I remember feeling that I wanted to make people feel like that. I wanted to do that, and so from that point on, actually, I started using lots of different pieces of software. There was this thing called EJ. I don't know if anyone knows that. It's like sequencing software, so I was playing around with that quite a lot. And then I graduated to FL Studio, then Ableton. Then I was very much convinced that I was going to be a great producer. I was producing loads of hip hop stuff. I was producing loads of beats. I'm going to be a producer. But then I think that at a particular age, I think maybe when I was getting to 18, I realized that maybe I wasn't going to be a producer because there were a lot better people out there doing stuff. And also it was in like the post-Napster age. And as much as we're in a conversation about AI now, I think I was very much scared. And then I was like, okay, well, let me just study something. So I studied business, which is maybe not the most creative of things. But then I kind of came back around, and then now I do film. And in terms of what maybe a new generation might be, how that might affect the new generation in terms of like AI and everything, I don't know. I think that maybe it will allow you to be more creative more easily. I don't know. I think it's an open-ended question, and hopefully something that we'll talk about.
Exactly. Purposely, it's an open-ended question. So we've had a little bit of a taste, I guess, from all of you creative industries entering it and what the changes might be. When we think about the space, I know with Magda, we were looking kind of the whole economy. If we zoom in on what we're actually talking about here, this is £108 billion annually. Over the last decade, the sector's output has grown over 1.5 times faster than the rest of the economy, and its workforce has grown almost 5 times the average UK rate. And so there's something that's important for the next government to think about, to plan, to get ahead of in this, the AI age. I wanted to ask all of you, and kind of feel free to raise your hand, whoever wants to come in on this, what support do the creative industries need from the government at a point like this to continue being that powerhouse of innovation, and while still embracing and not ignoring AI technologies? Who wants to kick us off? Go for it.
Shall I go for it? Okay. Well, let me just start by contextualising the music industry a little bit for you. So we're talking about £6.7 billion contribution to the UK economy. We're talking about 150,000 employees. There are 3.2 million employees in the creative sectors in total in the UK. So we're talking about significant numbers, significant opportunities. And we collectively want to continue those endeavours, to continue boosting the UK's economy and to support the creatives themselves. And we are really lucky and hugely passionate about the fact that despite that we are a small nation, an island in the world, we're the second largest net exporter of music in the world after the United States. So we punch well above our weight. Now, as I've already mentioned, creators and businesses supporting them have been utilising technology for decades. Nothing is new. And they are embracing assistive AI tools already. Paul McCartney, you may have read, he is using stem separation to try to enhance an old Beatles recording, which I'm sure will see the light of day before long. It has its usages and it has its benefits to creators, producers, composers, artists are all interested in exploring the benefits that can be derived from utilising AI tools. The big challenge they've got, the uncertainty that's being brought to their door, is the fact that there are very many technologists out there and AI platforms who feel that they are able to scrape the entire data sets, whether that is music in our case, or literature, or photographs, images, etc., in order to create a large language model which can be exploited to create alternative output music without the recognition or permission to utilise that music in the first place. And whilst there are certain jurisdictions around the world, the European Union have put in place AI-related legislation regulations. China, similarly, the US is ahead of the UK. We're lagging way behind, and we need support to ensure that creatives can utilise AI as an assistive tool, but not fear it replacing their creative endeavours, outputs, and opportunities. And I genuinely believe if we can get the conversations right, it's an acceleration play. The real meaning of assistive and assistance in terms of AI with the creative sector, we could all win out of this. At the moment, there is just a lot of tension in the system and nervousness. I hope you will be unpicking that as what this conversation unfolds.
Yeah, I also think that the government really can play a significant role in demanding transparency from these companies, because I think that, we all kind of know that these systems, whether it's large language models or image diffusion models, or if it's for music and it's music diffusion models, they are taking huge amounts of data from across the internet and from other sources. But we as users, but also as artists, don't really have any kind of view into where they get the stuff from and what actually constitutes the training data for these models. And I think that, as we've seen with some of the agreements that OpenAI have been signing with, and Google have been signing, and other AI companies have been signing with publishers and newspapers in particular, we saw some stuff about Wall Street Journal. There's also been Shutterstock and other kinds of organizations that do hold rights and data. I think that something similar could be done with artists. It might be that it happens with trade bodies or people that are representing them. But I think that there has been an argument, and I think OpenAI especially have been a little bit guilty of this, of saying, well, actually it's really complicated and we can't do it, and if we pay everyone, then it's going to make the model unsustainable. But also using copyrighted material, the copyright holders have to be, to some extent, consulted, or better yet, paid. And I think that governments do have a strong role in that. I think that they're almost maybe the sole bodies, because we've seen certain cases going to court and they might languish in courts. And I think that if there's a strong statement being made from one of the most powerful governments in the world, it can actually have a pretty big impact.
Thank you. Laura?
I just want to pull back a little bit and remind us all, like when you're talking about issues within the cultural and creative industries, AI is not one block, it's not one tool, it's referring to multiple methodologies and developments and applications. So I think what we're discussing already is generative AI. I think that's important for the audience watching as well, that we're really clear about what it is we're discussing. And I think it's also important to remember that humans created these tools, so it's also not technology that exists like in another space. It's still people making. The question correctly about how we continue to foster innovation in the creative industries. I think there are two major things that stand out for me, especially as someone with a relatively new lens in this community. So I've only been working in the cultural creative industries for about 13 months now, which my boss keeps telling me I have to stop saying. But I think of the generative AI text and data mining issue, which is what is being raised already. To my knowledge, there's only one in the world that is already agreed through a legal process that that's relevant and useful in commercial context, and that's Singapore. So it's still a live, open debate that absolutely should happen. And in my personal view, shouldn't wait for the courts to determine. Like, we should get a leg up. But I think that links to the real second point I want to make, which is that I think the UK, and certainly any new incoming UK government, which we'll see very soon, form, really needs to take a decision about what kind of country we want to be and how we want our relationship to be with the rest of the world. That's true for ethics, that's true for the application of these tools, but it's also true when we think about macroeconomic and fiscal policy. So the UK could, so many have argued, largely be understood as a service economy, not a knowledge economy. So for me, the real question is, to what extent does the Treasury and the new government want to take control of that, to basically stop our intellectual property from just bleeding off our shores, or for premature sale of equity, or for any other structure that you think about. And underneath that, of course, lies our understanding and enforcement of intellectual property regimes. So what is it worth when you make and create something? Those issues and that contextual challenge existed long before the recent spate of development and application of technology, right? And the advent of artificial intelligence, particularly the Gen AI stuff, has merely accelerated and kind of propelled our focus and attention on that. But underneath it lies a really fundamental question that I've yet to see any political party answer. Do we want to keep flogging our wares internationally and be primarily only creates ideas that are then sold to other places, or do we want to retain some of that value, and do we want to think about how we build things differently? So for me, this is like a fundamental question. As esoteric as it sounds, I think it sits underneath all the stuff we're talking about.
I think that's a great point you make there, Lauren, and I think it's one thing that I always find interesting in this kind of AI discussion. We were talking earlier about future of work, AI. They're not the same thing, and definitely a notion. I don't know, if we went back a couple of years, we might have been talking about Web3 and blockchain, and if we go forward a couple of years, it would be Google Gaga. And another 3 years it'll be Higi Haga. There's always going to be something, right? Technology is on the horizon. We're ready for. I wanted to pull in another bit of information and kind of roll us maybe a little bit in a slightly different direction. Work from the Braid and UKRI funded creative project has heard from frontline creators about the major changes already underway to both the quality of their work, which ties into what we heard from Magda earlier, but much of it experienced by freelancers who don't enjoy the same protections as so many other workers in the wider economy. We, of course, have the Good Work Charter at the IFOW, but what does it look like for folks to have job quality and well-being as workers? What does it look like in the creative industry? How might we legislate? How might we regulate? How might government or regulators ensure that we can support the creative sector where that nature of work is actually quite different from what we see in other parts of the economy? Who wants to take that?
Can I just off from one point right past the mic? Yeah, I think for anyone watching who's not from the cultural and creative industries, the key thing to understand is disproportionately high number of so very, very significant. I think 32% of our profile. So I think the second thing I say before passing over the mic is, if we get a new UK government that's led by Labour, we will find out very soon. They've committed to legislate already in the first 100 days around some of the differences between employment tax law and relationship to self-employment in particular. So the debate is hot. Mike, go for it, Jonathan. That's fun.
Yeah, Jonathan, well, so
Just building on that, I guess I think the value of human experience is really what human deal with them. I suppose it's slightly more looking at society. So I think education, education, and tech education, STEAM, not STEM, I think that's a very practical way. It's about a really important. Because it's not only that there are a lot of freelancers finding this needs. It's, I think, the danger that those groups will be less able to ask the other students in this area. This is some of the best we can see in it. But also, and then I'm interested in your point about music and the stats about the number of musicians. It's really impressive. But when you drill down into it, drill down into it, the number of musicians you've made a career and sustained a career is very, very bad. I just didn't show you the number of musicians who only find and sort of less. So I think these are all really points. And I guess the sort of other wider point is in terms of government is they've got to ask the level about Big Tech, because Big Tech owns this technology. And it's really the first technological breakthrough behind our dream that is actually not rooted in the public sector as a company. And we hope behind the private sector. Moment governments don't really deal with that, and that's where we should pay over something.
Yeah. So I think you can hear me all right with this mic. Well, first of all, yeah, I mean, just one minor challenge on Jonathan's point. There's actually the military is all over. One of the reasons the government don't try to regulate it more and know with more strenuousness is precisely because they want the sector to grow in the private sector so they can adopt military industrial complexes and work. But that's for a whole other panel that we can have another time. But I do want to talk a little bit about the project that we're working on, that the Turing and Queen Mary and UAL and IFOW have been doing together, our brain scoping project called Creative, in which we are centering the voices of artists and creative workers to try to understand what's happening to them and what they are already experiencing and what they see coming. And to Lara's point, we decided to focus primarily on freelancers because they are the most vulnerable workers. They also are a substantial share of workers in the sector. And what we're hearing is both unsurprising and very troubling, right? So the unsurprising part is that people are seeing work disappear. They're showing up, musicians are showing up at gigs where there are actually fewer human musicians required because there are automated tools that can, that can do the work that could stand in for their colleagues. Many of them fear the coming of tools that are good enough so that they will no longer be required to do retakes, doing studio recordings. Retakes are a substantial area of income for session players, professional musicians, and the possibility that these tools will get better and better and eliminate that line of work is something that's quite concerning to me. We heard from authors, translators in particular, translators who are, instead of being asked to translate material, now being asked to clean up and edit machine translation, which is totally taking the love and joy out of the work that many of them went into precisely because they were passionate about language and passionate about doing this work. Now, it's true that many artists are willing to do a great deal of work for love instead of money. But that's not what any of us want. That's not the kind of culture I think that we necessarily, that is enlightening for the rest of us. So we all have a stake in sustaining a creative culture and sustaining artists. And so, all these conversations, both from the perspective of the project, but also in all the conversations we have about this, we need to keep the artists, we need to keep the creative people always in view, and the value of those people to us in society, and also, of course, to the sector in general. And as the AI industry sells us all on a dream of reducing labor costs by automating everything and anything, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want? Do we want a world in which there are fewer and fewer people who feel any incentive at all to go into artistic creation, not to mention lots of other fields that are useful and important in the world? Or do we want a world that sustains and supports artists? So we asked one of the things about, what can the new government do? Well, there's some really basic things, right? Aside from intellectual property, which of course is a big issue, something needs to be addressed. Aside maybe from, tax structures for businesses and how they choose to use or not use automation, but also just simple things like investing in the arts councils, like ensuring that artists have financial resources so that as their jobs will inevitably change, as their lives and careers change because of technological innovation, that they continue to have something to draw from. They continue to have reason and motivation to stay in the game, right? To ride this out so that we can all be collectively flourishing with these new technologies instead of allowing it to be a steamroller that sort of casts aside those of us who aren't seen as economically valuable.
Can I comment on that? I mean, I think that is absolutely right. It's all about the framework that's put in place, and governments around the world working together to understand how you can sustain and support growth in technology, innovation, and what that can deliver for humanity alongside all other sectors. Where is it persisting? Can it help to cure cancer? If it can, get it working in that area. Can it help musicians enhance the performance that they provide? If it can, fantastic. But when it comes to substitution, that's where, as I will repeat, we get really concerned. And there's this really simple ask from our sector of government. And that is simply to say, for these large language models, keep records, know what you're ingesting, ask permission of the creative sector if you wish to use it to teach your large language model how to create alternative output, so that we've got a level playing field. If a license is required, pay it, because that's how you sustain the livelihoods of the artists, the composers, the songwriters, the producers, and all those freelancers in the background. We want to keep that economy going. And then ensure that that generative AI output is labelled so that we have transparency. It's lacking. And a survey that was recently conducted by Whitestone Insight, the UK public, the adult population, about 80% of them were saying that they absolutely support the notion that AI should be labelled as such. Let's make sure we know what we're listening to. And I won't, because it's pretty confidential, but I'll give you a little bit of insight. We are seeing generative AI music creep into the top 20 chart in certain markets around the world now. And it's not because they are active, necessarily participant listeners that are really enjoying that music, but on a link basis, after they played their curated playlist, they're fed through the algorithms these songs, and then they build up capacity. At what point does that start substituting the human artists that want to perform live on stage to huge audiences, etc.? So there are some relatively simple asks, and the final one is very interesting, and this goes to all this concern, particularly in this election period, both here in the UK and in very many countries around the world. It's around deep fakes, and in the UK we do not have adequate protections for artists in relation to their image rights, their personality rights. And so it's so easy for AI engines to take, I will reference Paul McCartney again, Paul McCartney's image and vocal tone and have him, or the AI version of him, perform other artists' work without any permission at all. And that just can't be right. It doesn't feel right unless those permissions have been granted by others. We need regulation to help protect those creatives and to help sustain their livelihoods for decades yet to come. Thank you.
Laura. Well, we wondered from freelance. I mean, we've covered so much ground already. It's wonderful. I don't think I can add anything to what you said in relationship to music. Creative UK carries most of those acts on behalf of its members. But what I would add is that there's again, I'm going to sound like a weird philosopher, but there's a fundamental shift. So what I've certainly seen in the narrative in the UK over the last couple of years is that the cultural and creative industries, you see that in all the parties' manifestos that are being published. Nearly all of them have recognized this is a powerhouse. This generates economic growth. But the bit that's missing, I'm pretty sure from everything I've seen so far, is recognition that culture and even creative expression as a standalone is a public good in the same way that we have come in the UK to think about our health service, the other things that we value and we cherish. And I think if you really want to protect freelancers, and we were certainly talking about this before, other countries do this stuff way better. There are a couple out there in Western Europe that you can speak to better than I can. But we were discussing how there are interventions that are available, and those interventions at a governmental level recognize that this is a public good as well as something that economically contributes. And I think we're missing that bit here in the UK. We haven't quite cracked that yet outside of the cultural and creative industries. We definitely would say they're a public good as well as an economic powerhouse.
Sharing is caring, Cassie.
Yeah, I'll talk about it a tiny bit. Well, I think it's also to do with rethinking a little bit what it is to be a freelancer and how freelancers are supported, right? So the conversation that Laura was alluding to was, I was just talking about the fact that, so I grew up in France, and talking about how in France, artists and creatives there is a system that supports them. So for example, if you do a certain amount of days of work, you are then supported by the government on the days that you aren't working, because, it's kind of recognized that actually you are contributing to the public good by creating art. Is really important. We know that artists aren't necessarily going to get work all of the time. We want you to be able to live, so we're going to support you to live during the times in which you're not working. I think that something like that could be
quite attractive, quite good, and obviously clearly because other governments are doing it. Because France isn't the only country that does it. I know that Germany has a system similar to that in different states. I think Italy has something similar, and I think that the UK could do something similar too. But also, I think just in the rubric of rethinking what it is to be a freelancer, I do think that the idea of freelance work has kind of permeated the world of work in the creative industries in ways that it didn't necessarily have to. I think that, there have been lots of economic incentives to kind of, parcel out work. So, for example, I work in documentaries. I know that, for example, in the past, the BBC didn't have that many freelance directors. They had directors on staff and they'd send them out to go and do stuff. Whereas now it's very rare to find a director on staff at the BBC, certainly not the BBC, but even in the companies that are kind of the clients of the BBC. And I think that actually when we are thinking about bringing AI into our workflows and recognizing that maybe there are going to be fewer people in the pipeline, maybe what we can do is actually offer fewer quality jobs, because I do think that we have to be a little bit honest. Like, I personally very much foresee in the near future that we might see documentary teams go down from teams of 20 to teams of 12. But actually, we need to think about what those compositions of those teams of 12. Can we actually guarantee those 12 people work all year round instead of, ad hoc work that actually is really difficult, and then you have to go and have a million meetings to get the thing. And I think that actually is something, and, I'm talking about my particular industry, but it feels like it's something that actually could be applied in lots of different ways across the creative industries as well.
Definitely, and beyond. I think it's definitely, something we're seeing, that whether it's gamification, whether it's those kind of micro jobs, or it's folks, doing several projects at the same time, that isn't something that's limited to creative industry. I think it's a fascinating point that a lot of the times it's not inevitable, but that should be the direction of travel. However, we're seeing with technology that enables it in such a big way that it's not something that's going to disappear. I wanted to move us on to collaboration and the wider ecosystem. When we talk about the creative industries, we spoke earlier about how diverse it is as a system. That 106 billion gaming and kind of video games is definitely a big part of that. I know we've not touched on. What should be being done across the ecosystem? Who should be collaborating? How can they do that in this age of AI? And is there anyone externally, other than maybe big tech, that we might not have covered already, that we should be considering as part of that wider stakeholder map, that collaborative ecosystem to support creative industries?
You ask such good questions. Who should collaborate in the ecosystem? Well, something that I think is really under-recognized, there was a mention of Arts Council funding as one example. The creative industries as an ecosystem, a lot of people will describe it as fragmented. My time in it has shown that it's just very diverse. I don't actually think it's fragmented. That's not a phrase I would ever use. When you give people protected time and space to connect to each other, they find points of commonality very easily. They just haven't had enough headroom, because a lot of folks in the UK have been in existential crisis for quite a long time. If you're struggling to survive and your organization can't persist, of course you're going to be in a different headspace than one which recognizes that there are common issues across the creative economy. When I think about collaboration and that facilitates the cultural and creative industries, I think of not just really what seem like radical notions like UK government thinking about patient capital. We're seeing public investment as something that's good, that helps catalyze private investment in a way that facilitates the growth and the resilience of this industry. But I think about something way more radical. I think about this notion, which doesn't sound very fancy, but when we think about the future, you mentioned STEM versus STEAM. I want to think even farther than that. When you think about the future and how collaboration should really properly occur, look, most of the children and young people I know are not growing up thinking about stuff in different widget boxes, the way we still do in policy structures, the way we still do in educational curriculum. So what I think the wholesale biggest thing we could do to increase collaboration would be to return the value and emphasis, not just in educational curriculum at the earliest possible stage, but the value of creativity and critical problem solving and thinking. So you see from the data, it's quite clear, when you give people creative skills and creative education in subjects and lots of different types of disciplines, it crosses over and has portable value in a multitude of industries. It's just not as binary as the way we think of it. So when I think about collaboration, I think we have to, in some ways, we have to let go of our own labels, even the one which says, oh, we live over here and technology lives over there. I mean, that's just fundamentally not true. Loads of the technology was developed by people coming from the cultural and creative industries in the same way they port over. So sometimes I think the greatest collaboration needs to start with recognition that people and tools and knowledge are much more porous than we give them credit for, right? The world is complex and nuanced. I get that. And that makes it harder for systems to manage and negotiate that. But so for me, a very starting point principle is like we need to sit down together and recognize we've got a lot more in common than we do that is defined and separate. So that doesn't sound again too esoteric, but I think it's so important in the context of AI.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear you say that. That's basically what we've been trying to do at Somerset House for the last 2 years, is build a home for innovators, but we don't recognise each other as very recognised labels. We can work together with what Brian Eno called seniors. So great ideas don't come from alone in the country of senior running. Seniors, they come from seniors places. I think that's something that this country has been very good at. I think the context of a lot of this conversation is about government. I definitely think certain things need to happen with a new government. We need the end of culture wars. And we need the end of this sort of absurd levelling up policy that actually almost does level down. And places like London, which one has to celebrate as an extraordinary creative policy. It's not about breaking that up and spreading it around the country. It's about giving access to everybody to that cluster. What we have. And I think breaking down boundaries, other kind of areas that we should be looking at, government should be thinking about is how can artists, for example, play a role, can creators play a role in marketing. We're in a world where we face so many problems that nobody to know how to solve. Actually, artists are fantastic. They shouldn't feel that way from having solved some of these problems. The very nature of an artist is there a kind of, I like to think of them as a sort of societal early warning system. And they talk about things, think about things way before
I'm in on this on a slightly different perspective with some experience of working with the IPO, DCMS and UK government on their voluntary code, like good practice code around AI. Very many meetings, AI technologists, platforms, educationalists, and the creative sectors. There was a real moment in time where collaboration was possible. And we missed it. And we missed it because I think it's fair to say, and what was eye-opening, because you're all, you're in your bunkers and you're believing that AI could be bad for all, etc. And actually there are good actors in the AI tech space that want to do the right thing, want to do things ethically. But they got drowned out by the bad actors. And so rather than persevere and take positive sentiment and suggestions to actually buy into the idea of record keeping where content is suggested or label outputs, because how couldn't we do this? We're technologists, of course we can do this. Rather than embrace that whole initiative got put in the bin. And so I think what that taught me, that exercise, was that collaboration is possible and needs to reform. And particularly with the new government, I'm really encouraging of them, whoever they may be, to bring those participants back to the table. And dare I say it, if need be, leave the bad actors as edge cases and take them out of the room and get us working with people that do want to embrace the ethical use of AI in the right manner. And then we can start to formulate a way in which we can positively, from a directional perspective, embrace the technology of work for them. We really do need that resilience in that system in order to do it. And finally, on that point, what I will say is that in the music streaming world, despite the fact it's pretty mature now, we've had all sorts of issues with metadata, with transparency issues, etc. The IPO, DCMS have worked with the music industry alongside the tech platforms to come together to create codes to make some positive differences. They've proven they can do it. So I encourage them to go again and to work with us smartly so we can genuinely collaborate.
Thank you, Paul. Even though we've missed the collaboration boat, we can get back on it. I like the idea of bad actors. You can have bad actors who kind of You know, they don't hide it. You can have good bad actors that turn up and pretend that they're good, right? But there's sometimes a little bit. No, just me. The final bit, in the interest of time, sorry, Laura, and I'm sure what you're about to say will relate to this question anyway. Skills and training is always a big one that we know the government has levers on, not just, as you said, those in education, kind of pre-18 or pre-21 or even younger, but the whole way up. We talk a lot about core skills and tech skills, and IFOW has some recent work out on what are the skills that folks are looking for in particular jobs. How has that changed over time? And again, you know, as we said, there are particular tech skills that come and go, but the core skills, some of the critical thinking we spoke about as well, Laura, are ones that are increasingly desired and valuable across the economy and definitely within the creative space. What are the programs? What are the initiatives? What should the government be driving to ensure that you know, those that are working across the creative industries able to stay relevant in this new landscape, or stay funded, maybe stay paid, stay employed, stay engaged? Wow, your question just gets bigger than the stars.
No, that's okay. It's really funny. Gosh, there are going to be people on this panel with probably more detailed knowledge about programmatic approaches, but I've got to go back and reinforce this notion. So in different parts of the UK, it's in different places, but the core curriculum from when you're a small child, right, we stripped out in most of the stuff that's state funded, all that's different in parts of the UK, anything about creative skills and subjects. Okay, it's been hollowed out entirely. The single greatest thing we can do is build that back in, and then you would need to marry that in the pipeline in terms of what opportunities are available to you all the way to 16 via the further education route, and definitely in higher education institutions as well as workplace learning. So I mean that in and of itself is the number one thing we've got to start with. I wasn't gonna floor hog. I wanted to go back and just say for people watching, IPO means the Intellectual Property Office. DCMS is referring to the UK government's Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I'm a big fan of breaking down the acronyms so we make sure people understand what we're actually talking about. And then actually because DCMS changes as well from at one point the digital. Anyone remember that? Yeah, that's not DCMS's fault. That's political mastery, isn't it? But I'm sure we'll see some new titles possibly in a couple of weeks. What else can be done? Well, I think employers need to take a bit of responsibility for understanding too and making sure that there are workplace opportunities for those that are outside of employment structures. There's something very straightforward policymakers could do. They could make sure that anything that they're pushing out for skills and training is fit for purpose for freelancers. Like that would be a really amazing start. So there's a fit test, right, in terms of any policy that's going out the door where funding is provided, whether or not it's at a local or regional or a national level. But you know, that and putting the creative subjects and the creative skills back in education. Those are my two big interventions, and they would take. The second is probably easier to do than the first. The first will take us like a decade to realize, you guys. That's what we're getting our states on.
I want to come in on this one. I just want to echo something that Laura was saying, which was that we need to continue to train and actually reinvest in training artists to be artists, right? Like stripping out funding from schools and it's just part of it. You know, we think about this in terms of like skills. Often we turn to, we just need to retrain people to use the technology. We're basically we're telling artists, we need to retrain you to use the tools that are potentially threatening your livelihoods, right? Like that's not necessarily a logical outcome. On the other hand, if we continue to invest in artists as artists and increase their value, increase the ability for them to demonstrate their value to society and to the sectors that employ them, they're less likely to be seen as something that is easily replaced, easily annihilated. Good jobs are easily automated out of existence. Again, I just want to focus on the fact that keeping the creatives, keeping the artists in view at all times is essential. As something else Blair also said earlier about that these are all human decisions that are being made. This is not, the technology didn't just fall out of the sky or didn't just grow out of the earth. Decisions decided to make this technology, and humans are deciding to employ it, to implement it in a sector, in an industry. And if they're not careful, the people who are making those key decisions about what gets made and how it gets made are not careful, they're going to find themselves with very few people left to actually do the making. Right? There is no creative sector without creative people. So the temptation to automate many roles and jobs out of existence is actually a suicide pact. And I urge the creative sector to take that very seriously. And also, at the risk of floor-hogging, I also want to go back to the collaboration question, because one of the things I see that we really need to avoid is thinking that we can collaborate with the big technology companies. They have zero interest in the well-being of artists and creatives, and very little interest in the well-being of the creative sector, except as seeing them as large paying customers for their products. But they're not going to be good collaborators. They're not going to be good actors. They've been secretive. They've already violated rules and laws and terms of service. They are too big to care, as some people have would point, right? And so we have to look at them squarely as adversaries, as potential opponents in a long game of trying to ensure that the UK has a viable and vibrant creative sector, and that UK artists and creatives continue to have a nourishing environment in which to do the work that we appreciate them doing for us.
Thank you, Mike. I've come out from behind my lectern as I have the roving microphone attached to me. We've got time for maybe 2 questions from the audience. So I don't know if that puts the pressure up or not. Do we have any? Oh, there's a question there. Should we do this as the roving? If I have a glamorous. You might need it for the folks, but for the folks at home, just I don't know if you can shout as far as wherever they may be. Go for it.
Just in the weeds question here, who pays the royalties? Is it OpenAI when they're doing the training on the data, or is it when you put a prompt into ChatGPT that then the royalties get distributed based on the response of the prompt? What's the policy here?
That's a fantastic question. That's a joke. Well, that's the point. Yeah, that's the point.
Okay, so that's a great question. The simple answer to it is we'd love to start the conversation about who pays what royalties for what. The bottom line is there's just been obfuscation that they do not want to entertain, particularly the large tech companies, any conversation about who would pay a royalty by the point of ingestion, etc. So that's what we hoped. At the code of good practice, we would start to engender the spirit, willingness to have that conversation. It is not happening. It's not happening. So just treat it as music laundering right now.
Next question.
So my name is Fender. I'm basically a Somerset House faculty in designer. And it just occurred to me that the there are a couple of ideas. And so I'm sure other people in this room today. And how can we get together in a room with the government? Because it's almost like an echo chamber that would agree that something needs to be done, but we're talking to ourselves. How can we get the government with the policymakers in a room so that we can collectively exchange ideas? And your point about collaboration is taking place, but okay. For example, I'm collaborating with a gaming developer in the gaming company who are going to be played out durably in the game. So they are happening, but it's just no one knows about it because there's no company.
Sorry, I don't want to hog the mic either, but I think one thing I can give you some reassurance around is whether it is the Intellectual Property Office, and thank you for reminding me, I'm you need a jargon buster with the acronyms that I use, and the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, whether it is those things, they are heavily invested in listening, and they are curating groups of people to understand the issue. They've got a huge amount of complexity to unravel. But our plea really is work hard with that complexity to reach adequate regulations and solutions, because others they are there, and if they're not there, they're getting closer to it than we are, and that's why we need some acceleration in these discussions and processes. But to your point, all the creative sectors are coming together, and I've seen more collaboration as a result of AI and what opportunity and challenge it presents to us than I have in the 30 years I've been.
Did Jonathan want to go?
I just sort of add to that. I think why your question is so good is the timing. Because actually, there are a bunch of competition with the whole market, and we may usually what they don't do is right with possible very good market. I agree with lots of things that have been said today. I think that's money that we're not going to have. But we're creating people. So let's have ideas about ways we can reframe what we have and make a more of a place like language. And they want to listen. I really agree. And I think it's good moment.
But with TV,
talk to your MP, but I'm truly sorry, you need to talk to people who are debating right now. It's really important.
In the interest of time, I did have one final question I was going to ask, but we're going to do a bonus question from the audience and then we're going to have that set Abby. Bonus question, it's a good one.
I just wanted to ask here, do you not think that you're oversimplifying the threat of artificial intelligence in regards to creative industries, simply because the confusion is not without merit? When you're talking about artificial intelligence and conflating it with automation, that is a significant confusion. And also, I don't think that the technology that is out there presented today regarding artificial intelligence is completely closed off, because there are other tech companies that are involved. It's not only OpenAI, it's also Meta, it's also Google. They have different niche in the ways that they would conduct their business with government. But I'm generally in favor of legislation with regards to intellectual rights.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question and provocation, and I'm glad that you brought it up. I mean, I think it's definitely important to understand a couple of things that I think you were pointing out. That's something that actually Lara said earlier as well, that AI is not a thing, not a single thing. There's no one app or a tool that is AI. AI is an idea. It's a marketing term. It's perhaps a set of disciplines, right? So AI is a broad label that's used to describe a lot of different kinds of technologies that do a lot of different kinds of things. And some of these things are things that probably aren't, that aren't particularly problematic, probably aren't considered to be threatening to, artistic lives and careers and so on. In fact, we know that many artists, of course, they love using these technologies. I've loved using technology in my artistic practice, and there's a lot of goodness there that we should keep in view, right? That we should be aware of. But honestly, I'm not here to tell the positive story, because it's an enormous technology industry who has huge teams of professionals doing that work all the time. I'm here to tell the other side of the story, to make sure that the potential risks and threats from emerging technology and the inclination to use it to annihilate labor rights and labor protections and so on is an important issue that needs to be raised again and again and again. So if I'm coming off as overly negative, I'm simply actually trying to balance a debate that is against some rather powerful speakers with very loud megaphones. And yes, you're right. There are lots of different companies who are in this business, but all of them are very large, and all of them are going to serve themselves first, and maybe the rest of us later.
What a note to end on, what a call to arms for a new government. If you'd like to join me in thanking our fantastic panel